Welcome to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
I'm Shannon Lawrence.
And I'm MB Partlow.
Quick content warning before we get started. This podcast may contain language and disturbing content, so enter at your own risk. All right. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
We are here today with our guest, Pete Klismet. And Pete, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's about 3 o'clock, and I'm in Fort Collins. This is Pete Klismet, Kalismet. I'm a retired FBI agent and worked in several different offices. I was trained, I was a real live FBI agent for a while, and then I was trained to be an FBI profiler. And one would think, oh my, well, all FBI agents are trained to be profilers, aren't they? No. Profiling boot camp, for me, as I call it, lasted 3 weeks. And in the academy, as the basic academy, all agents go through, they might get an orientation of, 4 hours. But my boot camp was 120 or so. So I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa at the time. I went to school, profiling school, and then went back to Cedar Rapids. And again, what most people believe is that, well, if you were a profiler, then you're working out of Quantico. No, there were 50 of us from the field that were selected at one point of, 9 or 10,000 agents throughout the work. So it was a very selective group. How they got me, I don't know, but anyhow, they got me. And that meant I went back to the field. I was in the Omaha division, which encompassed Nebraska and Iowa. I was about as far east in Iowa as you could get. But my job was, if we had a request to assist with a homicide investigation, usually, then I would go there. A lot of people, you'd look at the show on TV, Criminal Minds, I think it is, and you think, oh, they jump in an airplane and away they go. I didn't have a lot of airplanes available to me. I did have my bureau car, so I would drive wherever I went. So the story that we're going to go through after Shannon's done with her presentation focuses on the first case I handled out of profiling boot camp. And it turns out it has a number of behavioral characteristics that I'll talk about here in a little bit. So anyhow, that's enough for me. Shannon's probably rolling her eyes. So
She would never.
Oh, never. And
No.
so, to get into just the FBI, it helps, right, to have a police background or a military background. You have both.
I have both, but there are other ways to get in. Back when I got in, which was, I don't even remember when that was, 1980. You had to, you could have a background as a police officer, military background, an accounting degree, which, an accounting degree, to be a lawyer and to have a Spanish or some other language ability, and that was about it. So, with a degree of sorts. So that's
that was with the, because I do kind of accounting, bookkeeping, all that stuff, and I was like, hey,
Yeah.
I could go be in the FBI. They don't want me.
Yeah.
But
Well, we definitely want you. But yeah, you'd have been great. There was some other major point I was about ready to confront.
and
Well,
then
in any event, that's the FBI Academy. It's very selective to get in. A lot of people think, oh, it's like the military. You raise your hand, and they swear you in and cut your hair. And that's not really it. You go through a long testing process, and for some odd reason, there were 35,000 people that submitted an application to the FBI in the year that I was hired. It was 1979. And so anyhow, there were 3,600 people that came out as eligible. So a lot of those, I don't know, 30,000 people just thought, well, I can raise my hand and they'll hire me. But no. So out of that entire group came 3,600 people.
Mm.
And by some odd coincidence, and I didn't cheat or I didn't pay anybody off, maybe a little bit, of that list of 3,600, I wound up being number 4. And that wasn't, Shannon would say, no, I was 4th from the bottom. You're bonehead. But anyhow.
I would not.
But not.
Would
So
not.
anyhow, that's the long and short of it. A lot of people ask me the question, aren't you all trained as profilers? The other question I get asked very frequently is, well, are you profiling me? I mean, people think that's the, first time I've ever heard that. And the answer to that is no, that's not what I'm trained to do. We all profile one another. If you think about that, and this is the best answer I've come up with. We all profile one another when we first meet each other and get to know each other a little bit. Okay, that we all do that. We all have that ability. So what I do or did is to assess behavioral characteristics involving a crime. That was what I did. I didn't profile, a case and say, well, it's a werewolf or anything, because the TV show, and a lot of people have asked me that, is the TV show unrealistic? I've given a lot of talks, and I've never failed to get that question, particularly from like 13, 14-year-old kids come up and, Agent Klismet, is that show realistic? And is it? No, it's not. And there's, in my 4th book, which is college and university textbook now, I do an entire chapter on that topic. And, Criminal Minds is very much unrealistic, like CSI is, because, the CSI show on TV, you got a bunch of guys who really, in real life, spend all their time in the lab looking through microscopes. Okay, on the TV show, they look through their microscope, then they run out and they jump in their Hummer and they've got their gun. Now, these guys don't even carry a gun. If they were with me and they had a gun, I'd run. But, it's a fingerprint guy. It's a blood guy. It's I don't even know what guy. But they're all scientists. They're not trained with guns. And so I'm running and they're out running around a crime scene and they're kicking in doors and they're shooting everybody and finding blood, and, whatever they do. And none of that happens. If I'm the investigator, I'll go out. If I find one of them at the crime scene, I'll kick them out until I request them to be there, then collect evidence, do that, take it back to the lab, assess the information, then call me and say, Pete, okay, here's what we've got, and here's what we know, and you can use anything you need with that. So anyhow, that's a long blabbity blab way of, explaining a couple of points that are really not commonly known.
Yeah, it surprises me. Like, I know the question, is the show accurate, doesn't surprise me. I'm surprised that people think every FBI agent is trained as a profiler.
Right.
That one surprised me. But we haven't chatted since my daughter became hooked on Criminal Minds and Bones. She loves Bones and Criminal Minds because both have characters she can identify with. She's autistic and she loves the actor's name is like Matthew Gruber or Grubler. Spencer Reed. She loves Spencer Reed because, he's basically autistic. I don't remember if they ever say he's autistic on the show, but she just, yeah.
Spencer, he's got 3 PhDs or something.
Oh yeah. And she plans on going to get a bunch of degrees too. So there you go. But But yeah, she's been hooked on that one, and it's been fun. Like every once in a while, I give her another factoid from you. So I was like, yeah. They don't have a jet. They don't just don't get to hop onto their personal jet and fly off to wherever they want to. Just
and they get there in time to find the body lying there still warm. I mean,
yes, it's astounding.
All I would do, and in this case, I'm going to apprise you of. All I would do is go there, get the reports, read the reports, look at all the pictures, collect any information that I could collect, and then plug that into my head. And using the training, the experience that I've got, then try to construct a profile, of what type of person. I'm not giving you a person's social security number and their home address and phone, but I'm going to give you some characteristics about that person. And you know that, Shannon, because you've sat through a number of my different presentations.
That's right. I'm supposed to come and heckle you.
That's your job.
It is.
Yeah, you and some other critter that I wouldn't mention.
That's our Charisse there. That's our job, is we come and we heckle you. Yeah. I showed up to a panel at a con recently, and somebody asked if I was there to heckle, and I was like, oh, I'm good at it. Do you want me to heckle you? And they're like, wait, no. And I said, don't ask for it if you don't want it.
Yeah. Every time that happens, I give both of you guys the fang eye. It's like, I'm going to kill you. I think I've threatened to kill you.
I think probably.
But it would be.
It is probably even on tape.
It probably is. And then you could very easily profile that killing. And so I'm in jail. But
I know. Evidence.
Anyhow, back to something I thought of as we were talking here. I would love to have had you as a fellow agent to work with, or as a fellow profiler, because I've known you quite a few years now, and you are about as sharp as anybody I know.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. So
I would say sharper than a lot of people we know.
You would think what?
I would say she's sharper than a lot of people we know.
Yeah. Well, it'd be handy to have somebody around that's sharper than me. And away we go. So we do a good job.
That would have been fun.
Yeah, it would have been fun.
So let's talk about your books a little bit, because our guests on here are always authors. And you have books out on on going through, really two in the process of going through the academy. And then one on a case that happened here in, southwestern Colorado, that if you have family who are in police, that one's a tough one to read about.
Yeah.
So I did read it though. And I do have, of course, cop siblings. Only two now. My brother is retired, but my youngest brother is in, and my sister is now a detective. So up in Denver. But yeah, that was a tough one. And then you have your textbook. So tell us a little about your books, just so people know.
Well, right now, I've only got two available to purchase. The first one is essentially what we're going to be talking about, and already have been talking about this morning. Involves me and the process of going through, as I characterize it, profiling boot camp, because it was horrible. I was seeing things. I'd been a cop for 10 years, and I was seeing things that, oh my God, I couldn't imagine. So anyhow, we had about 6 people that quit in the first couple of days. They can't take this. So we went through that process, and that's what this book is about. It characterizes, this is called FBI Diary, Profiles of Evil. Okay, Profiles of Evil. And it goes through the training. It goes through a little bit of what I was doing before they picked me for training in profiling.
Okay.
And then go through the training and then get out of the training. And from that point on, I still worked cases, still did the same thing I did. But if we got a request to do some, provide some assistance on a case, then that's exactly what I would do, no matter how far away it is. So The case that I'm going to be talking about, luckily for me, was only 20 miles away. That didn't happen very much, but so that's what this book is about. Number 2 book was FBI Animal House, which I guess it reviewed, shall we say, a bunch of interesting activities which I may have been in charge of, so to speak, which are very involved with, I'll say, that were not something that you would think that would happen in the FBI Academy. And one of the reviews I got on Amazon was from some guy that said, well, this book can't be true because the FBI would never allow something like that to happen. Well, of course they weren't. They didn't. They weren't watching all the crazy things we were doing. And I'm serious. I'm going to get that book redone and get that thing back on the market. And it's going to be quite interesting. It's an interesting book. And the third book is called FBI Diary, Homegrown Terror. It involves a assassination of a police officer down in Cortez, Colorado. And I think that's the one you're talking about, Shannon?
Yeah, it's a rather brutal assassination.
Yeah, very. And did you read that book?
I did. So most of the book is about the manhunt trying to track this guy down.
Yeah.
And it's pretty crazy. I think you even went over state lines there. Like it was all over the place because he was in was it canyons?
Yes. Yeah. Canyons and rocks. And I mean, you could have hid the Denver Broncos beneath some of the rocks. They were so, like Mesa Verde State Park.
Yeah.
Kind of a carbon copy of that in a way where they were searching. It was dreadful. So that's what that book is about. And I've gotten good reviews on that. It's like 4.5 out of 5. So, and then the fourth book is what I call the penultimate, I guess, book on criminal profiling for, as I mentioned, colleges and universities, some of whom are now using that. My luck usually is fairly good. It wasn't when this book was released by my publisher, big time academic publisher out in San Diego. Luck wasn't good because on the day this book was released, is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, released. Yay, you got the book out there and everything. Boo. That's the day that we all in this country became aware of COVID.
Oh, it released then. That's right.
Yeah. And so who's going to go out and buy this book? I mean, can you order it? Sure. But anyhow, so as I say, it's kind of the penultimate book on profiling. I wrote it in conjunction with, it was all my idea to do it, but I grabbed, no, that's not a good way to put it. I got lucky and found a PhD psychologist, and she works in the state crime or prison system out in California. And she was my co-author on the book. And it's really good. It's not cheap. Like college textbooks are right now. In hardcover in a college, it's about $150, I think. If you bought the soft cover from the publisher, it's like $79, which, isn't all that good, but it certainly gives you the ups and downs of what profiling is all about. And that's available through my publisher out in San Diego, which is Cognella, Cognella Academic. The first book, Profiles of Evil, is on Amazon. The other two, I'm going to get them back in print.
That's good.
So anyhow, that's the story of that. I mean, that's where I am right now.
What is that? I think that your signature says something like, if you can't do the work anymore, What do? You write about it. Is that it? I think that's, your email signature. I noticed that this last time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know me well enough to know that if there's something to be silly about and to abuse myself, I can do that too. So
that's right.
Yeah, that's basically right. Okay, so you have some stuff to do, right? You
Yeah.
need to
So I'll
something.
go ahead and I'll start this one.
Okay.
And so this person is called the Jinx Killer. And really, I never saw why they called him that. So somebody just assigned this. But I'm going to be talking about Robert Durst.
Oh, okay.
And he's a twisty, windy guy. His story, there's a lot of stuff I had to leave out, or this would have been like, you could probably talk about this guy for 2 hours on his own, because boy, he's just complicated and out there and probably did more than we know about. All right. On September 30th, 2001, a 13-year-old boy fishing in Galveston Bay found a human torso washed up on shore. Police divers quickly found 2 black garbage bags with other body parts in those bags.
Ew.
But no head was discovered. The body was identified by fingerprints as belonging to a local 71-year-old man named Morris Black. Black was well known in the area, including at a church and a homeless shelter. Both places he showed up giving out glasses to the unhoused, but he had been showing up at them before. And I think a lot of people assumed that he was homeless. He had been cantankerous, and that's really what he was known for. He wasn't especially well liked. He was the thorn in some people's sides down there. And he had a record of causing problems, overthinking he was overcharged on things. He thought everybody was against him. He had all these conspiracy theories. But one of the big things that he got in trouble over was this issue of, I've been overcharged. And so he actually had been charged in the past for threatening, they said, making terroristic threats to an electric company in South Carolina because he felt they'd overcharged him by $16. So he had been arrested for these threats because $16 of overcharge. And he'd actually almost been kicked out of his apartment at the time for getting mad about, I think it was like a $12. He felt that he was owed $12 back on his rent for something. And while he was a miser and frequented the local shelter, again, a lot of these folks thought he was homeless, but he didn't stay there. He'd just show up during the day. He actually rented a room in a fourplex and was discovered to have approximately $137,000 spread out across 9 bank accounts, but all at the same bank. So he had these 9 accounts, same bank, and he had plenty of money. He was making his rent, and no one could figure out where that money had come from or how he paid his rent because he didn't have a job.
Uh-huh.
And the glasses he'd bought in bulk were supposed to be around $2,000. And they know that because he'd asked the shelter to help him pay for them. He'd walked in there one day and just said, hey, I found this great deal because if you buy in bulk, it's way cheaper. And I want to go and I want to give these out to the homeless folks. So if you just give me $2,000, and the shelter was like, that's really not how we work. Would you like some food or a blanket? So he somehow got that money and he showed up with these glasses. Eyes quickly turned to Black's neighbor based on a few clues. In one of the bags of body parts, a newspaper had been found that still had a mailing address on a label, pointing them to 2213 Avenue K. And that's the fourplex that Morris Black lived in. Searching the trash, police found a .22 caliber handgun and a receipt for glasses with the name Robert Durst on it. Black's neighbor was an odd, mute, older woman named Dorothy Siner. According to the lease, that's the name that was on it, Dorothy Siner. When they searched Black's and his neighbor's apartments, both were bloodied, as was the hallway. A pair of boots with blood on them was found in that Dorothy Siner's apartment, as well as a paring knife police took in as evidence. And when neighbors were questioned, one of them said they'd seen Siner loading garbage bags into her silver car the night before the body was found. A tip, though, had police looking not for Dorothy Siner, but a man named Robert Durst. And they found him driving a silver car on October 9th and took him into custody. In his car, they found a 9mm handgun, some pot, and a bow saw. And of course, they've got a dismembered body. They're looking at that bow saw, right? And it turned out the bow saw wasn't damning. It had nothing to do with it. He hadn't used it for that. He just happened to have it in his car. The autopsy showed that a hacksaw had been used and then a paring knife. So they did have that paring knife on hand.
You've got to be pretty determined to cut up a body with a paring knife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What police didn't expect was that Durst wasn't just an odd man pretending to be a mute woman. No, he was the 58-year-old multimillionaire son of a multimillionaire real estate mogul in New York, specifically in Manhattan. And in fact, his father was described in one article as being the Trump of the 40s and 50s. He was responsible for a big chunk of the Manhattan skyline. I think it's called the Avenue of the Americas. He built a bunch of these buildings. He had a share in the World Trade Center. So this guy, he was big. He had millions and millions and millions of dollars. Even more compelling was the fact that Durst was already being looked at for 2 other crimes, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. Thus, his hiding out in Texas and pretending to be a woman. So he's called a cross-dresser in a lot of the articles. And yeah, technically, but he was doing this as a disguise, right? This wasn't something he was doing for other reasons. In the meantime, the woman whose identity he'd stolen was still living her life and had not seen Durst since they graduated from Scarsdale High School together in 1961. So
Wow.
he stole an old classmate's
Identity.
Yes. Unfortunately, before officials discovered how wealthy Durst was, who he was, that he had all these crimes behind him, he'd been released on a $250,000 bail, which you don't have to front that $250,000. And he was long gone by the time his court date rolled around.
Of course.
Not absent were press members from across the country who descended on Galveston, excited to discover where Durst had disappeared to. Robert Allen Durst was born in 1943, the son of magnate Seymour and Bernice Durst. He ended up with 3 younger siblings. When he was 7, his family made the news when his mother jumped to her death from the top of their 3-story home, despite fire and police trying to figure out how to save her when an employee spotted her on the roof and called for help. It was their maid. She called the police. A ladder had been propped up and a fireman was climbing it, and he was so close that when she jumped, he actually was able to grab her robe as she fell and hit the concrete. He wasn't able to stop her, but he grabbed her robe as she went by. So yeah, I'm sure that was something that stayed with him for a long time. And I did actually have the clip. I have one of the newspaper clips of this story being in the news. The children had been taken to a neighbor's. So I don't know how long she was up there. The article didn't say, but clearly this went on for a while, long enough for her to be spotted, for the children to be rushed to a neighbor, for all of the first responders being there to help out. But yeah, ultimately she didn't make it. Obviously, it was a 3-story building. But so they never saw their mom on the roof. But many years later, in a documentary, Durst would claim he'd seen his mother on the roof. In fact, he'd say his father took him to the window and pointed to the mother so that he would be watching. And that he didn't see her fall, but he heard a maid yell, "She's off the roof." His brother Douglas, who was the next oldest, made a public statement. This ended up a big thing after this documentary came out. He said he was lying and that encouraging his lies like this was detrimental and was giving him the attention he wanted. So speaking of Douglas, little brother, he and Robert fought so often that their father put them in counseling for sibling rivalry.
Wow.
So that they could work their stuff out. And when Robert was 10, a psychiatric report stated he had, quote, personality decomposition and possible schizophrenia. I don't think I've heard the term personality decomposition before, or I just didn't remember
what
it.
is that?
Right? So I don't know, because it's not like a formal. Though he was usually described as a loner by classmates, and even as an adult, everybody would describe him as withdrawn and a loner, including his wife and her friends. He does seem to have worked his way up through university until he went to UCLA to get a doctorate. He quit and moved back to New York in 1969. But while at UCLA, he had met a woman named Susan Berman, who we're going to return to in a minute. Back to New York, and Durst wasn't interested in joining his father's empire. Instead, he met a woman named Kathleen McCormick, who was a dental hygienist. Together, they moved to Vermont and opened a health food store. They appeared to be a happy couple, and when Durst's father convinced them to return to New York in 1973, they shut down their store and they went back to the city, and that's where they got married. Durst joined his father at the corporation, and Kathleen continued her work as a hygienist for a while, but somewhere things started to go wrong. Kathleen's friends witnessed Durst abusing her, once yanking her off a sofa by her hair. Before she'd been happy to follow his lead, And they would both talk about how, he was the boss or whatever, and she was fine with it at that point. But he increasingly took his power too far. And when he forced her to have an abortion, she decided to go back to school for her doctorate. Friends encouraged her to go to the doctor when he left marks on her so it would be documented. They were kind of pushing her like, okay, you need to start doing something about this. You need to report it. You need to document it. And she confessed to being afraid, but she didn't want to divorce him until she finished school. Plus, she wanted her share of his finances upon divorce, which, but when Durst assaulted one of her male friends for moving too slow when they were all together and the friend sued him, Kathleen figured this would be more documentation in her favor, but the Durst name had way too much power in New York. There was just no way. And it was reduced to a lesser charge with a tiny settlement, and she realized it wasn't going to benefit her. Kathleen knew she was in trouble, but she didn't know quite how much trouble. She had finally told him she wanted a divorce and had asked for a $250,000 settlement. So when they were first saying like she wanted her share of his money and stuff, I was like, just get out. Like, don't be greedy. Just get the divorce. Who cares about the money? But then I was like, a $250,000 settlement, requesting that from like a multimillionaire when you've been married for all this time actually sounds pretty fair to me. If that's all she was asking for. She wasn't asking for ongoing support. And I was like, okay. Sounds to me like she just wants the money to get through college, set herself up, and she'll start her own life. So she went ahead and she moved into another apartment. She was leasing an apartment. She had moved out. They were officially separated. Durst got really upset about all this when she asked for that settlement. So he removed her from all his accounts, cut off her credit card, refused to pay for her last semester's tuition. And so now she was like, she wanted to be a pediatrician. And so she sees her future crumbling. On January 31st, 1982, Kathleen went to a friend's house in Newtown, Connecticut to attend a dinner party. Kathleen was typically well-dressed. Her friend said that she would not go out in public without being dressed to the nines, makeup, hair, everything would be done. She was, to her, it was inappropriate to go out in public, not dressed nicely. But she showed up to this party in a sweatsuit. And so everybody, and she was visibly upset. Everybody felt like something was going on because this just wasn't like her. And while she was there, her husband kept calling. And she finally took this phone call from him. And her friend, I don't know how to say her name, it's Gilberte Najami. She heard him screaming through the phone. He was screaming so loud. And Kathleen got off the phone with him and said, well, he wants to see me. He's pretty upset. And I'm going to head to our lake house in South Salem. He's waiting for me there. South Salem was in New York also. And that was the last Najami saw of her. And they had made plans to meet at a pub the next day. And Najami was sitting there. She never showed up. And she couldn't reach her. So she calls in the police. She's like, something's going on. They were in a fight. There had been something huge going on. And then she went to meet him. And her friend had said to her before she left, and she'd said it before, if anything happens to me, you need to point them in his direction. He did it. Najami called the police every single day. And at first they kind of blew it off. She's an adult. She probably just went somewhere because she was upset. And then they contacted Durst, and he said, oh, I put her on a train. And she was on some kind of a tear, and I put her on a train. She's in the city. She's fine. He said that after he dropped her off on the train, he went to a neighbor's house and had drinks with them. But then his story started crumbling. The neighbors didn't back him up. They were like, no, he didn't come over. And so he said, oh, yeah. No, I stopped at a restaurant. And I just had I had some dinner and I had a drink on my own. The entire time, he had not reported her missing. So finally, on the 5th day after her disappearance, after he's already been contacted, then he reports her missing. But I think I put this later, but he doesn't report her missing in South Salem. He doesn't report her missing in that county. He reports her missing in Manhattan, where he has his power behind his name.
Nice.
Yeah. Not only that, so the police had been there. They went to the cabin. They questioned him at the cabin. They kind of looked around the cabin, but they didn't look around anywhere else. And it's discovered that he's already subleased her apartment that she'd been living in. That's already subleased in the day just right before the 5 days.
Oh my God.
He subleased her apartment. And he said, well, it's $900 rent. I needed to save that money.
A multimillionaire.
Yes.
Okay.
So he's under mild suspicion because, they're always going to look at the spouse, right?
Yeah.
And so he has his lawyer take some cocaine to the police and he says, I found this. This was her. She was a druggie. I think that a drug dealer killed her. And there's more inconsistencies. The stories just kept changing. He claimed to have put her on a 9:17 train to Manhattan, but she'd driven her Mercedes to the cabin. And I never could find, was the Mercedes there? Where was the Mercedes? Nobody ever mentions the car again, which I always find frustrating when I'm like, is it hidden? Was it there? Like, give me some real information. But she hadn't left Najami's until 7:15, and there was a big snowstorm happening when she left. So it figured it would take her at least an hour and 15 minutes just to get to the cabin. So that has her arriving around 8:30, we'll say. He claimed they had made hamburgers, ate dinner. She drank an entire bottle of wine. She changed her clothes. And then it was a 20-minute drive to the train station at least. And again, it was snowing and sleeting this whole time, which created a really tight timeline. So was it impossible? No, but they would have had to eat really fast, and she must have just choked to that wine right down. Improbable, a bit. He had also told police that he called and spoke to her at 11:30 p.m. that night. So she had gotten there safely. And so they said, okay, so we'll just go ahead and check your phone records then. And he said, no. I actually went to a pay phone to call her, so it's not going to be on the phone. And they were like, okay, the only phone bill, pay phone was 3 miles away around the lake on the other side in this snow and sleet storm. So they're like, but why? His building manager then reported back in Manhattan finding Kathleen's belongings in the trash. But police fell for it. They were like, okay, cool. You put her on the train. Clearly something happened after she got to Manhattan. And they basically closed the case. And then the media got bored and they were like, okay. And it was far easier to shrug and figure not our problem. Plus the medical school said they'd had a call from a woman the day after Kathleen's disappearance saying she was sick and wouldn't be coming in. Now the call didn't come in to who it should have, which she should have known because she was in her final year. But, it called the actual dean instead of who should have been called. They never searched the woods around the cabin. They never dragged the lake. They never looked at anything. They didn't look around in Manhattan much either. Case closed. But Najami and Kathleen's family, they started pursuing it on their own. And really, it looks like they still have been all these decades. And Najami actually went and took that 9:17 train to Manhattan on a Sunday. And she did this a couple times. And she learned that the same people were on this train every time. Mm-hmm. There was a consistent schedule for a lot of them. And so she was asking them, hey, did you see this lady? She had her picture and nobody had seen her on that Sunday or on any of the Sundays. And now you think train, you think really long and all these cars. This was a 2-car train. This was a very basic from this small town to Manhattan. It had 2 cars, one smoking, one non-smoking. And Kathleen was a smoker. So she asked around, never could find anybody. But it didn't matter. Case was still closed. Everybody had moved on. His old friend from UCLA, Susan Berman, very vocally supported him in the public eye, and we're almost to her part of the story, but not quite. First, we get to 1992. To Durst's shock, his father decided to leave the empire not to his firstborn son, but to his second-born, Douglas. So Durst was pissed, and he left New York. He cut off contact with his family. He became a transient. He briefly settling in multiple states. He showed up in all these places. He was using aliases everywhere he went. He had all of these fake IDs. He had the stuff he needed, so he was actually making them himself. He wasn't buying them from anybody. One of those states was California. In 1999, the investigation into Kathleen's disappearance was reopened. And this was really all credit to Najami being the forefront of this, but also Kathleen's family for supporting her in this. They got them to look at it again. Because Susan Berman had been such an outspoken advocate for him, police wanted to question her. She let Durst know what was going on, or this is what Durst claimed. It gets a little muddy here. Police think she might have been threatening him, actually, that she'd go to the police in order to get money, as she'd found herself in financial straits. She was struggling. And nobody could find any record of any police officers contacting her, of anybody contacting her about this. So again, it kind of looks more like she was fibbing and trying to get money from him. And she did get, I think, 2 allotments of $25,000 from him in this time period. Friends said she'd admitting to providing a false alibi for him in the case involving his wife. It appears she was the one who called Kathleen in sick to the college that day. That's why she called the wrong person. In addition, she painted Kathleen as a druggie and a failing student. She wasn't failing, and said Durst had never abused his wife, They did all hang out a lot. So she used this and said, I never saw anything. He would never do that. And they'd been friends since he'd been in UCLA. They'd been very close. So this was all very damaging for the case, right? Susan was the daughter. Here's where it gets interesting for me. Susan was the daughter of one of Bugsy Siegel's top lieutenants, David Berman.
Oh.
He had started out in Iowa, was recruited by Meyer and Siegel, and eventually ended up in Vegas. His name was Davy the Jew, is what he went by. And he actually co-ran the Flamingo with Bugsy Siegel. So this was a guy. During the investigation into his wife's disappearance, she'd been living in Manhattan as a writer for multiple publications and promoting a book she'd written about growing up in the mafia. But then she'd later returned home to LA to pursue work as a screenwriter. On December 24th, 2000, neighbors reported to police that her front door was open and her 3 dogs were loose. They arrived to find her dead, shot execution style in the back of the head with a 9mm. And I will say now, because I mentioned it, he had a 9mm on him when he was caught. At one of these points, it was found not to be the same 9mm used on her. While she'd grown up around the mafia in Vegas, there was no indication whatsoever she'd had anything further to do with them, and her father was long dead. He died during surgery in 1957, and we're in 2000. So she has it's not a mafia thing, nothing to do with that. I had an interesting aside here, though. Berman was Jewish, calling himself Davy the Jew, and was so enraged by the Nuremberg laws and the Holocaust that because the U.S. was not yet involved in World War II, he went up to Canada and joined their army. He enlisted so he could go fight in the European theater there against the Nazis because he was so enraged about what was happening. And his fellow soldiers respected him. They had no idea that he was a felon. He'd served and was at Sing Sing. And he was a major crime figure back in the U.S. He never told them anything about it. He never said anything about it. He was just a soldier there fighting. He did get injured and end up getting sent home eventually. But he went there and he followed through. I had some respect for that.
Yeah.
This brings us back to Galveston, Texas now. Durst had gotten out on bail and disappeared, and it gets weirder from here. He was later traced to Mobile, Alabama, the day before the hearing he'd skipped out on. He used Black's ID to check into a hotel there. Then he rented a red Chevy Corsica from a rent-a-wreck, paying for a month, and headed off into the sunset. Unbeknownst to police until much later, he then drove up to Atlantic City, stole a license plate there for the Corsica, drove by his old school, he drove by his childhood home, and he drove by his family compound. He was actually kind of stalking them during this time. Mm. Then on November 30th, he strode into a grocery store in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, his head and eyebrows shaved. He took a box of Band-Aids off the shelf, removed one, put it on a cut under his nose, picked up a newspaper and a sandwich, turned and walked out without paying for anything. So he got stopped in the parking lot, got arrested. Police found $500 in his pocket, but he just shoplifted. Police were about to release him with a summons because they just thought he was some transient, but he screwed up. When they'd asked for an address, he gave them his correct address in New York. And he had properties in multiple places, by the way, but he gave them his New York address, and they pulled him up. And here they're like, "Whoa, we've got something here." So they searched his car, found $37,000 just in cash, some pot again, and Black's license. It would take two. So here's where we get to the point. I'm going to sum up things from here on, because again, there's so much more to this, and he got into a lot of other legal trouble for a lot of other things. But I'm going to sum up what happens with the court stuff. He was tried in 2003 for Black's murder. The prosecution went for capital murder charges. They did not levy any lower charges like manslaughter or anything like that. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot. Durst had millions of dollars to pay for attorneys. So he had 2 very high-priced attorneys, one from New York, one from Houston. And then he wouldn't communicate with them. So pay him all this money, but don't communicate with them. So they went and hired a psychiatrist to see what was going on with him. Psychiatrist says, "Oh, he's got Asperger's," which of course doesn't exist anymore, and it's just plain autism. And they said, and his lawyers went, "Oh, great." And then so they start pleading, well, it's because he's autistic or whatever, that he did all these things. And so listeners know how I feel about that excuse for anything. That's utter bull. Ultimately, Durst said Black had pulled Durst 22 out and held it on him that night. They'd fought. And the weapon had accidentally discharged and killed Black with a gunshot to the head. And he even admitted to chopping him up. He was like, yeah, I didn't know what to do. So I had to cut him up and get rid of the body because I knew I was going to get in trouble. Authorities believe Black had actually figured out who Durst was and stupidly probably tried to get some money out of him. They'll never know. And they didn't have great forensic evidence. They never found his head. So he's saying, hey, this accidental discharge went into his head. Well, they don't know how he was shot. They don't know where the gunshot went in. They don't know any of these things to see if is this even feasible. I mean, or was he shot in the back of the head? Huh? Like, it was an accident and we were fighting face to face, but somehow he was shot. So they don't know. They didn't have this. And the jury ended up acquitting him for the capital murder. They didn't feel it could be proven. So then he pled guilty instead to bail jumping and evidence tampering. So we got 5 years. And since he'd already been in jail there for 2 years with all this happening, he got credit for time served. Got released July 15th, 2005. Violated parole. And here, coincidence of coincidence, he decides that he's going to go where he's not allowed to go because he had to get permission. And he runs into his actual judge from that trial in the place he's not supposed to be without permission. Like, what are the chances of that? So he goes back to prison, and then he got back out again March 1st, 2006. In a later interview, the judge felt he knew too well what he was doing when he cut Black apart. They were very specific about it being very clean when it was taken apart. And she felt certain he had done something like that before, that he wasn't new to this, but neither here nor there because no way to prove it. In 2015, police set out to track him down again to get him tried for Susan Berman's murder in California. They found him in New Orleans under yet another alias.
Oh, God.
And the way they found him is he called his home phone to check the voicemail. And so they were able to track him down. He wasn't bright. Like, he just was rich. They arrested him. Right. They arrested him with a .38 caliber. His passport, over $40,000 cash, a flesh-colored full-face latex mask that went to his shoulders. So like a full thing to tuck in. Do those ever look real? In a map of Cuba.
Of course.
Then they discovered additional cash had been mailed to him, and he'd removed over $300,000 in cash from his accounts in the last month. So they were certain his plan now was to flee to Cuba. Louisiana charged him for being a felon in possession of a firearm and for having a firearm while also being in possession of a controlled substance. He also had federal weapons charges because the FBI were involved. After a whole lot of tap dancing, again, this just his saga in court for 3 crimes was, and 4, because Louisiana said, no, before you take him to California for murder, we want to get him for firearm possession. And that ended up throwing a whole bunch of wrenches into things, right? But he just
prioritize people.
There's so much. And again, so that's why I'm summing it up. So we're just going to say after a whole lot of tap dancing, because again, high paid lawyers. After a whole lot of tap dancing, Durst pled guilty February 3rd, 2016 to the federal gun charge, getting 85 months. At this point, he was struggling with hydrocephalus and had a cancerous mass removed from his throat. These health issues, along with other surgeries, caused delays with all his trials. Then Hurricane Harvey came. Then COVID. That's how long this is going on.
Oh, my God.
Then COVID and everything gets shut down and courts get shut down. So he hasn't even been tried for the Louisiana charges yet. And that kept getting delayed too. So then we fast forward to October 14th, 2021, and Durst was finally sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Susan Berman, aided by the fact that one of his best friends came forward to say he'd confessed to him. And the fact that Durst changed his story multiple times, eventually saying he'd shown up to visit her and found her dead. There was a whole thing with a misspelling he made on an envelope that he sent to the police to tell him there was a cadaver at her house, and another letter, and comparing them because he always misspelled Beverly and he'd send it to the Beverly Hills police. He always added an I between the L and the Y, or an E between the L and the Y. It was a whole thing. So, but yeah, there was a bunch, there was a mess. And then it just blew up because he kept changing his story. The FBI has encouraged authorities in states where he had false and stolen identities to look at cold cases and missing women. So authorities really feel he did more than anybody's aware of. Among these states are Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, California. I think New Jersey when it was in there. There's a whole list of states that this man was in during this time. He had different aliases in each place he went. So they've asked people to look. He was even considered for the List case, the Long Island serial killer case, which because there were similarities in body disposal with Morris Black. But of course, now they know who the List killer was, the Long Island serial killer. He had other legal issues too, which I alluded to earlier. One that I found particularly interesting. In Houston, he walked into a CVS. He flashed his genitalia at some people. Then he walked over and peed on a candy display. Then he walked out. So he had gotten arrested for that. But there were so many little things like this. This dude was such a mess. His own family feared him coming after them, and they hired bodyguards. All in all, he was this utter mess. And happily, he died January 10th, 2022 of cardiac arrest. He was 78. Family members of his known and strongly suspected victims are going after his estate now. It turned out he had a secret wife during all this.
What?
Yes. I think they got married in 2000.
Oh my God.
And he had told friends it was a marriage of convenience, but what he had done when people, because the police were coming after him, is he basically signed over portions of his estate to her, right? And then he had her managing his estate so he could go into hiding and he didn't have to worry about it. But I think he was also trying to make sure that they couldn't take all of his money if it all came down to it.
Right, because it's in her name.
Yes.
Yeah.
As far as the probable murder of his wife, he was officially charged October 22nd, 2021, just a couple months before he died. So that never actually went to court. So it probably won't ever fully be resolved. And I don't believe the Louisiana charges ever went to court either. That or they were dismissed at some point. Because they were dismissed and then they said no, and they went and recharged him and then COVID and all that mess. So I don't think that one just ever happened. So my sources, Durst Case Scenarios by Gary Cartwright and Texas Monthly. I think this is the second time I've read a Texas Monthly article, and they actually have some really good pieces. So Wikipedia, NPR, NBC News, LoHUD, and Los Angeles Magazine were my sources. But yeah, I just found him to be such a twisty.
That's so crazy. The whole story is, and then when you come out with,
and then he peed on some candy.
But during this whole thing, he had a secret wife.
Yes.
Could he not pee on candy at home? I mean,
no.
Do you have to go to a CVS to do that?
It's not nearly as fun if people aren't watching.
I will take your word for that.
Well,
crazy.
Yeah, he was quite a piece. But and now we go to Pete.
this is Pete Klismet again, and I am a retired FBI agent. I'm also a retired college professor, and I've authored 4 books, 2 of which are available right now. The first book I wrote is called FBI Diary Profiles of Evil, as I mentioned before, and it is one that encompasses a number of different cases that I was involved in. I'm going to briefly go through one of those as soon as we get some information out of the way here. Okay, so it's a presentation I've done a number of times, and I label it Profiling Violent Crime. Now, what's the point of this? Why do we do this? Why do we do this criminal profiling stuff? Let's look at this. We have plenty of homicides in the United States every year. In fact, frankly, it seems like it's getting worse, doesn't it? With all these mass shootings that we seem to have. And I mean, it's almost like you can't swing a dead porcupine and not hit one of those, but a lot of them. Now, plenty of homicides. And the problem is we're really solving a lot fewer of them than we used to. What does that mean? Well, back in the 50s and 60s, and even perhaps into the early 70s, we would have in the United States about 9,000 to 10,000 murders. That's a shocking number, I'm sure, but we'll beat that here in a minute. The solution to those cases was about 90%. Okay, so the vast majority of them get solved. So that's the good news. Most of them were committed back then by family members or friends. And so things changed, though, into the 1980s and certainly the 90s. We were having 23 to 24,000 homicides in the United States. Well, that's a pretty startling increase. I mean, that's well over 100% increase. Why did that happen? Why would something like that happen? Well, part of the reason why it happened was the population of the United States increased. Granted, that's one reason. But secondly, and thirdly, and fourthly, there were gangs that started becoming prominent in, I'll say, the late 1970s, certainly into the early 80s. So gangs were becoming very prominent. Drugs were involved. If you remember, there was something called the crack cocaine epidemic back then. And that created a lot of problems with turf wars and everything. And then, and I'm not taking any side of this issue, but a lot of guns. We had a lot of guns in this country. And so the other thing that happened was we were having what's called stranger murders. And oftentimes that would mean serial killers. And so there was another reason. Now, traditionally, the way we would investigate a homicide and the way we were all trained, any time I've ever done a school for law enforcement officers, they all agree with this. The traditional way we would investigate homicides back then was we would look for who, what, when, where, and how, right? Mm-hmm. Now, is there anything missing?
Why?
Mm-hmm. And the answer to that is somebody mentioned, MB, I believe that it's why. Okay, why was something committed? Well, that gives us the basis for criminal profiling. Because the other things are important. Who, what, where, when, and that's all important. But what we can learn from the why something happened is, was the crime random or was it something planned? That's going to give us a lot of clues right there. Is there any evidence the victim and the killer knew one another? You'll say, well, that's important here in a few minutes. Why was this victim chosen? What was the rationale for picking that particular victim, if there was one? Was there a motive involved? And why was this location chosen to commit this crime? So to shorten the whole concept, what is criminal profiling? Criminal profiling is a process in which several things are used, most importantly, training of individuals. And as I mentioned previously, not all FBI agents are trained to be profilers. There was a period where out of 10,000 agents, there was only about 50 of us that were trained. So training is important. Experience is very important. I was a cop for 10 years. So it wasn't like I just fall off the turnip truck driving through town one day. I had some experience as a detective, as an investigator. And then finally, common sense. I mean, just applying common sense to what you're looking at will help you to identify behavioral characteristics. Now, as Shannon mentioned, behavioral characteristics involved in that Durst case, many. I mean, cutting somebody's head off is not something I try to do every day. So I avoid that, anyhow. So we're trying to identify behavioral characteristics of an unknown offender. Now, behavioral characteristics mean some of the things that we might find through a crime scene. First of all, some of the behavioral clues I look for would be how much risk was taken to commit this crime. Okay, with Durst, I don't know, but probably some. Was there overkill? Well, cutting somebody's head off might be a clue, but was to me, overkill means personal or anger issues by the person that did the killing. Thirdly, was the body covered? What does that mean? Well, what it might mean is there was remorse involved, that the killer knew the victim, or something called undoing, that with covering the victim, then you can sort of remove yourself from the crime, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Psychologically, it does very much.
Mm-hmm.
Is the body left where it will be found? Okay, very important. The demographics of the area, are they consistent with the crime that we're looking at? Were there wounds to the head? Was there choking or stabbing as opposed to a gunshot? Was the crime scene messy? Was it out of control? It would indicate to me that the crime wasn't planned out very well, and that we're dealing probably with a younger guy. Okay, somebody younger than perhaps 35, or certainly younger than 40. And the other thing that's a huge clue to me is spending time at a crime scene. If the crime occurred in somebody's house, and there's evidence by cigarette butts that were left that the person had a number of cigarettes and maybe had the TV on, killed somebody before all this. And
had a meal. Some of them have done that, just had a meal after they butchered somebody.
That happens. Yeah. Made a pot of coffee. I've seen that before. Made a pot of coffee and snarfed up a couple cups of coffee inside the place. Okay, so is that important? Well, yeah. Why is it important? Well, there again, with all these things I mentioned, that gives a real strong behavioral clue, because the presumption by me would be that if the person's comfortable being at the crime scene, then that means they're comfortable with the area where they are, because they know if they hear something, they hear a siren, then they can run out the back door, get into the alley, run down the alley, take a left at the dumpster, and keep on going. They know the route out of there. They know the route. So their likelihood of getting caught is very slim. So being at a crime scene for an excessive amount of time is pretty important. Now, the style of an attack is important. A lot of people think that in all sexual assault cases that some guy comes running out from behind a tree, pounces on the victim, commits a sexual assault. And does that happen? Yeah. In fact, it just happened down at the University of Georgia the other day. But the style of attack is important. Was there any torture or anything unusual that occurred? Was the body posed? What does that mean if the body was posed? There's an angle to that that's psychologically pretty hard to interpret. But okay, so with all that behind us now, and that's generally part of about a good part of a one semester presentation in college. When I was teaching in college, I would do. So let's see if we can solve a murder. Let me give you some facts. The demographics, again, as I mentioned, are important. Okay, so we're dealing with the town of West Branch, Iowa. Now, this is about 20 miles south of where I was in Cedar Rapids. Pretty small town, about 2,400 population. So it was a farming town. Most notorious for having the gravesite and a small library of Herbert Hoover, one of our former presidents.
Huh.
It was about 10 miles east of Iowa City, which is a reasonably big town, bigger because of the university there, which is probably 30,000. And it was 2 miles north of the only interstate that runs through there. So fairly described as a sleepy country town. Okay. A young woman by the name of Martine Harper, 20 years old, who lived in town, West Branch, with her mom, a stepfather, a 13-year-old brother, and an 11-year-old sister. Okay, so they were all watching TV, and she said, family said that she left at about 9 p.m. to go out and get a pack of cigarettes. Fine. The family said nobody else had left the house. Okay, well, that's what they say. The next morning at about 6:15 a.m., a farmer was going into town, as they routinely did, to go talk about the Iowa Hawkeyes football or basketball or whatever it was, and meet at a restaurant there in town. And so on his way into town, about 5 miles north of town, he saw this body lying up ahead in the road. Didn't know what it was when he approached, but stopped and figured out it was a body. Got out, looked, got the body. The victim's body was pointed in a direction, the head in a direction toward the town. Okay. It was a well-traveled farm road, so somebody was going to find that victim. Again, we talked about the behavioral facts. That's certainly one of them. It's an area surrounded by farmland. And if the killer had wanted to dispose of or hide the body, then could have very easily taken the victim and driven some miles east of West Branch to the Mississippi River. And there was a bridge there, of course, thrown the body in the river and remove himself from suspicion. Some other pertinent information includes the fact that the body was found on the road where it would be found. There was no effort to hide the body. The body was lying on its face, on its chest, or on her chest. There were 2 bullets in the back of her head. They were .22 caliber. So they were straight inward. Then there were 3 in the back of the head at about a 35-degree angle. Now that tells us something, and that tells us that the victim was down at that point, was dead. And there were 3 more shots in the back of the head.
Overkill for sure. Mm-hmm.
What?
Sorry, I said overkill for sure.
Yeah, a little overkill, but it's an important fact too. You're right. They were at a 35-degree angle, meaning the killer was standing above the victim and shot directly in the back of the head. Okay. Interesting behavioral things, all of those. But to me, the most important behavioral thing was the fact that part of the woman's body was covered with a warm winter coat, a man's coat. Okay. So there are more things involved, but let me just get to this. The sheriff and the sheriffs and deputies in those small counties like that are not really the most sophisticated people because they don't have that much stuff like that. And the DCI, the Division of Criminal Investigation agent from Iowa, both believe that it had to be a serial killer. Okay. So, great idea, not true. So,
right. Were there other cases they were pointing to, or they just went, well?
Well, there's got to be a serial killer right here. Because they'd heard that on TV, probably watching Criminal Minds. I don't know. In any event, what is pertinent about the location of the town? Well, a lot was. It's 2 miles north of Interstate 80, and it's not exactly someplace that you're going to drive into, to get gasoline or something. Not likely. And then drive 5 miles north of town. Was there any unusual behavior of the victim that was killed? Well, not really. She smoked, went out to the convenience store nearby, and walked over there and was going to get a pack of cigarettes. Had she gone out for a walk? Well, no. She probably couldn't walk that 5 miles north of town in a night that was as cold as that one was. In fact, the morning she was found, I believe it was like 5 to 7 degrees below zero, cold. Behavioral clues, the number of times she was shot. And Shannon, I think you mentioned overkill right there. Yeah. Definitely overkill involved in that. Okay. So what does that mean? Let's see. In this case, it would probably mean, and did, that the killer was mad at the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just because you get mad at somebody doesn't mean you're going to shoot them 5 times in the back of the head. So the angle of the shots tell us that, again, overkill, that wanted to make sure that victim was dead. But there's anger involved in this. Serial killer involved? No, not a chance of that, because a serial killer was not going to leave a victim lying in a place where the body would be found, nor would the victim have been found with a heavy winter coat over the body. Also, there might have been sexual assault, perhaps, if it was a serial killer, not always. And so all of those things combined with some others told me that it was not a serial killer involved. Okay. So then who committed the murder? Well, somebody committed it. Some of the facts were the victim's mother had been convicted of murder 20 years before Tina's death.
Interesting.
Who had she killed?
Somebody out in Nebraska, I don't remember who it was, but had committed a murder, had been convicted for it, and had been released. So she was not a serial killer, probably. So an interrogation of her showed that she had a solid alibi for the entire night. She didn't go anywhere. Okay. The interrogation of the stepfather was a different story. Now, the family had covered for him and said, oh, well, he was here watching TV. And we were all sitting around smoking and watching TV. So I got a chance to talk to him. They wanted me to come down and do that, part of the investigation. So I did. I explained introduced myself, and then explained my expertise, of which I had none, because I had just gotten loose from the profiling boot camp just a few months before. And in fact, the investigator from Iowa Bureau had sat in on one of my classes. I did a class, just an orientation to profiling. And Rick Sawasik had been in the class, and that's why he got a hold of me. They thought, well, maybe Pete can do some good. Well, okay. So I talked to them and convinced them, look, this is not a serial killer. There's a lot less involved than that. So I talked to the stepfather, and I mentioned to him, I said, in my vast experience, people have a good and a bad side. Well, that's probably true to all of us, right? And with a little bit more involvement than that, but I said, is it possible that the bad John might have done this? Well, that kind of brightened up his eyes, because he thought, oh, okay, so the bad John, so that means I'm a multiple personality or something. Of course, this guy wasn't bright enough.
Some deflection there, right? Like, I don't have to take responsibility because it was bad John.
Exactly, yeah. So could the bad John have done it? And his answer started out, well, ... maybe, ... And on we went, okay, from there. And as it turned out, he and the victim had been, let's call it friendly, for a good part of the time that he was married to her mother.
Ugh.
And while being friendly with the mother, was also friendly with the daughter. And what he told me was he went out to get a pack of cigarettes. Now, the family said he didn't go anywhere. He went anywhere. 3 people say, no, he didn't. Well, he did. He told them, I'm going to go get some cigarettes. So what he actually did was got in his truck, went over, picked her up at the convenience store. They went out for a ride and argued about, she said, that's it. We're not going to do this anymore. I've had enough. So thank you, but no thank you. This made him mad, extremely mad. And she said, well, then I'll walk into town. Screw you, so to speak. And the way she went, he got out of the truck, followed her for a little ways, trying to talk her into not leaving him or leaving parts of him. But anyhow, and that he would like her to come back. And if she didn't, he was going to shoot her in the head. She didn't come back. She was walking toward town, and he shot her in the back of the head 2 times. And then when she went down, he shot her 3 more times in the back of the head. So pretty apparent that's what happened. So long story short, John Frank Roth was the killer. And he wound up in Anamosa State Penitentiary for a life sentence. Appealed, naturally. They all appeal. I didn't do it. Well, he did it. And he wound up in the penitentiary for quite a few years. So anyhow, any questions about that? Go on, but I won't.
No, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. As soon as there was a stepfather in the house, I was like, he did it.
Well, I got this one. See, MB, that's why I said she needed to work with me. She's sharp.
Yes.
She had that figured out.
I didn't immediately assume, okay, the stepfather did it until you said the jacket was placed over her.
A man's
jacket was placed over her. And then I was like, yeah, that's
okay. As it turned out, it was one of his that was in the truck. But you know, the behavioral aspects of a lot of this are important. To me, that was the most important one, because why would you put a jacket over somebody who was lying out on a frozen country road when it was 5 degrees below zero?
Well, and how long had he been her stepfather? Like
about a year.
Oh, so very new. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, relatively new.
Remorse.
So,
like, hey, bud, you know what? She can't feel the cold anymore there, guy. But thanks for the thought.
Yeah. Remorse. And what I mentioned earlier was the undoing. If I mentioned that, because, well, if I cover her up, then that takes me away from the crime. I've seen that on a couple of occasions on a very notorious case that I worked out in Nebraska, where I did a profile on a case and said there was only one person involved, couldn't be more. And as it turned out, some very incompetent investigators wound up arresting 6 people, convicting all 6 people, all of whom were totally innocent, because there was only one suspect that could have been involved. And they all went to the penitentiary with an aggregate total of 72 years for 6 people. And later on, one of the guys said, well, I demand that you do DNA. Well, DNA didn't exist at the time they committed, or allegedly committed, the murder, but they did DNA on them, and none of them fit the evidence that they found in or on the victim. And they later matched that up with a guy who, as the profile said, was a young guy. He was 20 years old, I believe. He lived in the area. He had spent some time in the victim's apartment, made coffee, and hung out there for a while. And He had been in a prison, had been convicted for rape. before, and that's exactly what he did with this victim. So it can work. And my wife really gets mad at me, but you two guys have known me long enough that I've done a lot of them, and I've never been wrong on one. Now, does that mean I'm really sharp? Probably not. Does that mean I've been pretty well trained? Probably. Yeah, I haven't missed one yet. So,
but you're sharp enough to not miss one yet with your good training.
That's right. But I'm not as sharp as you. So you could have nailed these things. It's like name that tune. You'd have had that thing nailed in one tune, one beat. So anyhow, that's one story. In the book, FBI Diary, Profiles of Evil, there's probably 6, 7, or 8 more stories. There's one at the very end of what I just mentioned where the 6 people were convicted and sent to prison on an unimaginable, what I still call and other people call the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the United States. 6 people convicted of murder they didn't commit.
That's crazy.
Get on my,
That's, yeah, because there's a couple cases like that, right? Where all these years they go after a group of people for something that one person likely did, right? And they somehow managed to convict all these people. And I can't think of like the names of these groups. There's at least 2 famous cases in the US.
One was in New York.
One was in New York, and one was in the South with 3 younger boys.
Yeah, in Memphis. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, that's what it makes me think
Nikki
of.
Talk about the Memphis.
No,
different one.
Right, but our coroner talked about, but yeah. So it's always kind of scary to see that kind of miscarriage of justice where it's such a stretch has to be used to convict these people, and it still happens. But then sometimes there's not even so often there's a case where the person clearly did it, but for whatever reason, it doesn't matter if they clearly did it if you don't have the evidence that can convict them, right? And they get away with it, and you wonder, how was there evidence for people that didn't do it?
Let's see. Is there a classic case? Oh, let me think for a minute. Oh, some cat named OJ.
Yeah.
There was never a case where somebody was obviously more guilty than that.
He was so well liked, though. People wanted to believe he didn't do it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And he was liked in that particular area of town where they tried the case, if you get my drift. So,
there's a lot of power in charisma. There's a lot of power and just being known and people not wanting to believe. The thing is, people will figure out a way to make what they want to be true or not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They will rationalize it however they need to. That's an amazing thing about humans.
They will convince themselves that what they want to be true is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's quite a few more cases that I could recount that are interesting. I mean, the craziest case I've ever worked is that one where 6 people were convicted. So anyhow, guys, that's about all I've got to offer for right now. I know you've got a limited time, so
so we'll shoot over to MB Burst.
You haven't called me that in a long time. You're saving it up and just
hit you with it randomly.
I'm like,
yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to talk about a woman whose name is Tausha Morton, and it's Tausha, Tausha. So, and it was so funny. It cracked me up when I picked this up because when I started putting the pieces of this together, some of the sources I looked at were not in chronological order. So I start taking my notes and jumping back and forth, and I wrote the word intro. And just left it there. I mean, I did write an introduction, but like I would somehow forget.
Oh gosh, maybe I should intro this.
No, I'm just going to start in the middle. So Tausha Fields was born at the end of August in 1975, which happens to be shortly after Charlize Theron was born.
It was 2 years before I was born.
Ted Bundy was caught that month, and NASA launched the Viking 1 Mars probe. So, because I love to set a scene, people were listening to Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell, Get Down Tonight by Casey and the Sunshine Band, and Fame by David Bowie. Those were what was playing on the radio. And I can remember hearing all of those on the radio.
So I think it was Angie when she was on here that did something like this to set the scene. And I was like, man, Imby is so happy inside right now.
And it was. And what were people watching in the theaters in the summer of 1975? Jaws.
Yay.
Which I still blame for my uneasy relationship with the ocean. So we're going to jump ahead a little. In 2001, outside of Columbia, Missouri, Tausha met Mitch Kemp. He had recently been divorced after a 14-year marriage. So when they met up, she was 26 and he was 37. She was young and blonde and cute and outgoing. Her neighbors and her coworkers described her personality as very exuberant. She was always curious about the world around her. She made friends easily. And the thing they emphasized about her was when you met her, when you were getting to know her, she always made people feel like she'd known them forever. It was very easy to fall into a friendship with her. One of the things she did was she talked freely about her past with her friends and her acquaintances. She told them about how her entire family had been killed in a car accident. She told them about some abusive relationships she's been in, abuse she suffered at the hands of her family. So Mitch wanted to take care of Tausha. So in September of 2002, they had a baby girl. And a year after that, they got married in Pensacola, Florida. But by the end of 2003, Mitch's job, and I can't remember what his job was, but it wasn't like, he wasn't like a big executive. He was a real working class, hardworking guy. But his job was taking him out on the road more and more often. So Tausha was kind of lonely and bored being left at home with the baby. So she got a part-time job at a local gym, and they had the owner of the gym on, this woman who owned it, and was like, yep, she came in, she started coming in and she brought the baby in, and then they would do daycare, and then she got a job at the gym. And this is where she met 35-year-old Greg Morton. So Tausha shared her tragic life story with Greg, telling him about the physical and sexual abuse she had suffered as a child. She also told him that her new marriage was falling and said she had filed her divorce papers. So the divorce never actually happened, but in early February of 2004, she called the police to report that Mitch was abusing her. She said he had lost his temper after an argument. Apparently what happened was he found out she was stepping out on him, and they did get in a big argument, and he lost his temper. And if I am remembering this correctly, he slapped her. I'm not saying that's right, but it wasn't an ongoing thing. It was an argument, and he slapped her. He did not, I will point out, he did not contest the charge, and he spent about a month in custody before being released on probation in mid-April. By then, Tausha and her daughter had moved in with Greg. So a custody battle ensued because Mitch was like, I want my daughter. He wanted that baby. He fought for custody of his daughter, even while the divorce went through. And while the ink was still drying on the divorce decree, Greg and Tausha drove to Arkansas and got married. Arkansas, why? Who knows? So at some point, Greg drove Tausha to a meeting with Mitch. I think they were supposed to be discussing custody, but they got in a huge argument, and Greg stepped in to negotiate between Mitch and Tausha. When things got physical, Mitch hit Greg over the head with a chair and knocked him down. Yeah, I'm like, because that's not something that happens every day.
Right.
So a few days later, Mitch disappeared. By the end of the month, Mitch's mother filed a missing persons report. Police investigated but found no indication of foul play, and they believed that Mitch had run off of his own volition and didn't want to be found. He did have a couple of other possible legal problems outside of this, and they thought he was just on the run. He's just skipped out on his responsibilities. He's got this bad divorce. He's got custody problems. He's got other legal issues. So they were like, he's just taken off. So a few months later, and they made a big deal about this, where Tausha and Greg were living Greg had a farm that he had inherited from his grandfather, and he loved this land. He was always doing stuff to the farm, doing stuff to the land. So a few months later, he put the farm up for sale, and it really surprised people because he really loved that place. So it sold in early 2005, and Greg and Tausha left town and moved to Gulf Shores, Alabama.
Wow. Going to all the best places.
All the best places. And it seemed for a while like life was going really well for them. I'm like, how they didn't, anyway, they had a lot of luxury items. They had very fancy cars. They had jet skis. Greg got Tausha's name tattooed across his back. She got breast implants, as one does. By fall of 2005, the money was running out. And I'm like, well, yes, if you sell your house and you get a big chunk of money, you can't just spend it like water running through your hands, or it is going to run out. It does that. Anyway, so money was running out. Greg went to Mississippi looking for cleanup work after Hurricane Katrina. While he was gone, Tausha found a new man. Greg came home for a visit, and there was this man in his bed, which did not make him very happy, and he kicked her out. So early 2007, Tausha's working as a daycare assistant, and she met Dwayne Barentine, whose son attended the preschool. She was very sweet to the child, which impressed Dwayne because he was a single dad with full custody. He said, oh my God, he said things like every night when his little boy said his prayers, he would ask God for a new mama. Oh, I mean, just rip your heart right out. So she was, like I said, she was a very attractive woman, and she dressed nicely. So she gave a coworker her phone number to give to Dwayne. And within a month of, here's my phone number, call me, she and her daughter had moved in with them. I just like, God damn, she moves fast. Happily ever after didn't last very long, because less than a year later, Dwayne caught her cheating and kicked her out. Oh my gosh. In February of 2008, remember Mitch, missing Mitch? His sister-in-law had found Tausha's MySpace account. And that's going back.
Oh, wow.
Because his family had continued to look for him and had continued to look for her because she had dropped off the map as far as they were concerned. She emailed Tausha a couple of times begging for any update on what could have happened to Mitch. Have you heard from him? Have you seen him? Do you know where he might have gone? Because his family loved him. They cared. She never answered. However, after Dwayne kicked her out, Dwayne got into her MySpace account. Initially, he got into this account to fuck with her. He was just going to post shit on her. Really, do not give people your passwords. Do not leave your computer open to your Facebook or your MySpace account.
Yeah, I've had spouses prank each other on Facebook, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So while he's poking around in her MySpace account, he finds the email from Mitch Kemp's sister-in-law. And because nobody's heard from him since 2004. So Dwayne did know that Tausha had been married to Mitch. She'd given him the same stories about her past that she gave everyone else. However, the difference is Dwayne didn't buy what she was selling. He did not just buy into this. And he also had an extra piece of information. He talked to Keith Jones, which is the man that Tausha had lived with after Greg, but before Dwayne. So the two men had crossed paths when Dwayne was moving Tausha into his house. And it was apparently not a bad meeting. It wasn't like her and hitting somebody on the head with a chair. The two men talked about the fact that Tausha told all these stories about her past, and they kind of looked at each other and said, do you believe everything she says? And they're both like, nah, we do not. Keith said Tausha had told him that Mitch had raped her so that Greg had killed him. Apparently, Tausha and Keith were getting drunk one night, and she spilled the beans about this. And so Dwayne said to Keith, do you think this is true? Keith's like, nah, I don't think. Nothing she says is true, so why would that be? So Dwayne asked Tausha about it, and she said Keith was just trying to make trouble between her and Dwayne. So he let it go for the time being. But when he saw the letters from Mitch's family, he did three things. First of all, which this is so devious and yet smart, he changed the password to her MySpace account. So she could not go in and delete anything or change anything. 2, he reached out to Mitch's family to say, I have seen these letters, so I will let you know. And 3rd, he took what he knew to the local police, who this time they decided we could be looking at a homicide instead of a missing person. So in all the years Mitch had been gone, because they re-examined the case and realized there had been 0 activity on his credit cards. He had not filed any income taxes. Nobody had used his social security number, his driver's license, nothing. Everything had gone flat. So what else did authorities discover? The first thing just shocked me. I don't know why. Nothing should shock me anymore. Tausha's parents were alive and well. What a surprise. Mitch's mother had spoken to Tausha's father before the two got married, and he had tried to warn Mitch that her family would have nothing to do with her, that she's been pulling this kind of bogus bullshit for years. And but we understand you're attached to her, and we're just giving you this. And Mitch would not hear anything about it. And by the time she'd married Mitch at age 26, she had already been married and divorced twice. There were other men that she lived with on this timeline, but there is no accurate account available, because who's going to step up and say, well, yeah, I took her in for a while.
I was one of those suckers.
Yeah. Also of note is what they didn't find. There is no divorce for Mitch. That was never filed. So after Dwayne threw her out, she moved in with a man in Dothan, Alabama. And on May 20th, authorities took her in for questioning. Now, she initially denied knowing anything about what happened to Mitch. She eventually said Greg told her he'd killed Mitch, but denied being there. She claimed it was fear for her life and her daughter's life that made her stay with Greg after that. So she was too terrified of him to leave. And that happens. She went, I'm like, wait, where'd I go? Totally looking at my notes and going, wait, where was I? Okay, so she went voluntarily with the authorities back to the farm to show them where the body was buried. But when she got there, she couldn't remember. Can you hear the air quotes? Or she was purposefully misleading them. And the police were very unhappy because she's like, well, maybe it's here. Well, no, it looks different. Maybe it was over here. And they had the ground penetrating radar. They had dogs. They couldn't find anything.
It's like the guy in the Moors murders. Yeah, I'll take you all around the Moors so I can get out of prison. I'm not actually going to lead you to a body.
So she goes back to Alabama, and the investigators finally track down Greg, who is now in St. Louis. So they want to talk to him, but he immediately lawyered up and refused to talk to them. So they went back to Tausha and let her know that Greg was still at large and hinted that he knew Tausha had been talking to the police. So they took her to the farm a second time. And I can't help but think, and the police have got to be just like so fucking livid that they have to take her back a second time. Because this time she took him exactly right to the spot. It's like, oh, oops, it was right here all along.
It's under this rock where I wrote in chalk, here lies the body.
Yeah. So they found Mitch's body. He'd been shot several times, and there were shell casings in the grave. So they went back to St. Louis and arrested Greg, and Tausha was set free. Between August and December, Greg did not say anything to implicate her. So authorities tracked her down again. By this time, she's in Texas. So when they pick her up on December 19th of 2008, this time she has an entirely new story to tell them. This time she admitted that she was there when the shooting happened. She also said that she was still seeing Mitch while she was married to Greg, and that Greg found out and killed Mitch in a fit of jealous rage.
All right.
I'm like, you could have a scorecard. You could not keep track of all the stories. So in June of 2009, Tausha had been in jail for several months. Her bond was set at $1 million because she was considered a flight risk. Mitch's family had custody of her daughter. Greg had been in jail for about a year. But right around the 1 year mark, he cracked. He was just done. He confessed to shooting Mitch, and he got 19 years for second-degree murder. So then they took Tausha to trial. And prosecution maintained that Tausha was the mastermind and Greg had been talked into shooting Mitch at her bidding. He thought he was protecting her and her daughter. And while he was on the stand at her trial, and they made a big deal about how unusual this was, he broke down and apologized to Mitch's family for what he had done.
Good.
So because of the sheer number of stories that Tausha had told over the course of the investigation, at her trial, the defense rested without ever calling her to the stand. Because I think they thought she's going to come out with some kind of bullshit story we have never heard before. We're not going to know what to do with that. She was found guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just so she is filing an appeal, of course. And what I found interesting, her daughter was initially with Mitch's family. Now she is in the state system. That's how they put it. She's in the state system. But the girl's paternal family has visitation rights. Okay. So they do see her. I don't know.
That's still really, she hasn't been through enough. They couldn't just freaking raise her, finish
and
raising her.
I don't know anything. Now, I watched an documentary about this, and they did have a lot of stuff with Mitch's brother, who comes across as a nice guy, but that's not hard to do. But it was just, and they talked about, I think before she was 30, she had been married and divorced 5 times. Because she just kept marrying people, and I'm not even clear that she did divorce all of them.
Even fully legal because she hadn't even divorced
Mitch, who was the husband number 3.
Mm-hmm.
So my sources for this were Murderpedia. The documentary series is called Snapped, CBS News, and the Columbia Daily Review. And I gotta say, the CBS News one was a transcription. I didn't watch the film. I just read the transcription, and I was like, it was so full of loaded questions. So you would say she was a mastermind at spinning stories, because they'd be like, well, she was always talking about her hard knock life. Yes, she was quite good at spinning yarns and getting all the sympathy. And I was like, oh my God, that's so I didn't want to use a lot. I got a couple of things I cherry picked out of there, but I was like, that's practically yellow journalism.
Like leading.
Yes. And the people are all like, well, yes, since you put it that way, she was. I just, holy crap.
Now that you mention it.
But it was very unusual because she didn't pull the trigger, but she got the more severe sentence.
I forgot to mention my sources for what I talked about that case, but it was me.
I know. Well, that's what I figured.
It was like, your case.
You don't really need to provide a source for that.
Yeah. The other thing is, Shannon, we talked about that book in Cortez that I did. I am now in contact with a producer who found the book and decided that would be an interesting story. Whether he turns it into a movie or turns it into a documentary, I'm not sure yet. Mm-hmm. But we've been working together fairly closely. And any day now, I suppose, I could go flying off to down in Durango and Cortez and start going through the crime scene, interview more people. And at some point, we're going to see this thing in TV or something. As you know, I've already been on with several things like that case from Nebraska. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, that's
I was trying to remember what I'd seen you on. You were on one of the shows being interviewed, and I couldn't remember which one it was.
Yeah.
Definitely keep us posted.
It would be greatly ironic if you were on the show Snapped, though. See so the eyebrows go up when I laughed when she said Snap too.
I'm glad we're talking about a show that involves murder because, as Shannon knows, that created one of my murder threats, I guess.
Yeah, not a fan of the claim that somebody has snapped because
it's just not a favorite. And let's see, what's the other one that makes me nuts?
I don't know. That's my primary focus when harassing you is really.
Yeah.
Actually, I think every time on here when somebody says something about snapped, I'm like, oh.
Where's Pete? Yeah, you guys used to get going. You and Sharice used to get going, and I'd hide under the table. My God, how do I shut them up? I love them both. But I'm not going to kill them.
That's right. Because there is no other way. As anybody will learn, we're going to sit front row.
Yep.
And you can't get away. There's no escape. Yeah. So, those were some good stories. I think they illustrated a few different things there.
Yes.
So, and you were talking about, of course, the overkill and the remorse and stuff, right? And I can't help thinking, I really wish that at this point, obviously, it would be skeletal remains of Durst's wife. But I feel like it would be so telling if anything had been done that could, the man had a billion guns. Every time he got caught, he had a different gun on him, right? So I imagine probably it was a gunshot there too to start. But I would just be really, really curious. It would be interesting if they ever were to find her skeletal remains, if they were able to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because, clearly. And it would be fascinating if there were more found on him. But I think that attention isn't going to be really paid that closely. And they did have some specific ones when I was looking it up that it just wasn't worth listing. And one of them was far, they were reaching. I felt they were reaching about the Long Island serial killer on that one too.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not the only one to chop somebody up and put them in bags of garbage and distribute them in water. Anybody living around water, I'm pretty sure there's at least one bag of body parts in each river.
Yeah.
And I did a case a while back about the crime. Oh, and I can't think of their names, but I believe it was 3 men, and it was way, way, way back in the day during segregation. And these 3 people disappeared on their way down, and they're looking in the Mississippi River for their bodies, and they're finding other bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that about the Willamette, I know there's other stuff in there. If you look at any body of water, I feel there's bound to be.
Isn't that now the case you mentioned? I think eventually their 3 bodies were found in a car in a huge berm, buried over with dirt over them. There's a movie about that. You may have seen it, Mississippi Burning, and it's a good movie. Yeah.
Oh, it's good. Movie. It's hard. It's a good movie though. I saw that when I was fairly young, so it stuck with me for a long, long time, and that's why I wanted to cover it when we were doing this.
When you and I were talking, by email, you mentioned the red wine case down in Durango, and I am working on that, not diligently enough, but I've got some things written on that book. And just for the listeners, if there are any listening at this point, if I haven't put everybody in a coma by now, but this involves a 13-year-old boy that went down to visit his dad, didn't want to go, hated his dad, and wound up getting killed. Not your typical, boom, boom, gunshot, stab, stab, not that type of thing. But in any event, very interesting behavioral things that when I went down, they asked me to come down and pointed out some things to them that, again, behavioral things. The boy's body was taken up to a place where it was placed behind a tree, a fallen tree, but placed there almost as a memorial, I suppose. Why would you do that? Oh, gee, I don't know. Maybe you knew this. Long story short, and I think you guys may know that it was actually the father that did this, where it was an accidental death. I don't know. But he was convicted, and he now is on a full scholarship to Canyon City Penitentiary.
And I didn't know, because I remembered when you were working pretty closely with the mom's family, with the mom and her family. And we all pretty much, right? Like everybody, I feel like knew that it was the dad, right? But proving that, of course, is always a different thing. But I
Yeah.
didn't realize until recently that there had been a conviction finally. So that was news to me.
Yeah.
And I was happy to see it. But
Yeah.
that paid off because that was a lot of your time. I feel like that was quite some time where you're going down there and you're maintaining. But it doesn't matter until the evidence is found to be able to convict.
Well, no. And if you're a hard-nosed old Pollock like me, and you just don't give up,
Right.
And, I've always said there's a lot of people that have wound up in prison, courtesy of me, that, they may have been smarter than me, but they aren't going to outwork me. I guarantee you that. And Shannon, you know that. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah. You've known me many years. So.
Yeah. So no, I was really happy that finally came to close. And it's good that I think that is something that you should put a book out about because
Yeah.
there's a lot of involvement. And that's a story that I think people all over the country were hanging on, obviously in Colorado, but that hit national news quite a bit.
Yeah, it did. And I've had some people contact me and say, Pete, you really need to write a book about that. Yeah, I know, but I've just been lazy.
It's work.
Yeah, I've got doctors follow me around with scalpels that, take out my knees, my shoulder, and Lord knows what else. So,
yeah. Well, and for a while there, you were constantly kind of being hit by news stations wanting to talk to you about it over and over and over again. I imagine there were things you couldn't say. I mentioned there. So, yeah.
It was obvious it was the father, but the best I could say is we have a person of interest. Was that the father?
We have a person of interest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was tricky. Well,
you guys know I've had a pretty crazy ride of things, and somebody said, Pete, you have a very colorful life. I mean, you were in submarines, then went to college, then the police department, then FBI, then profiling, and college professor. And those aren't the usual career paths that people take,
No.
So I think I was.
You've got a boring life.
I have not had a boring life, no. And I'm glad, I'm retired. And do I get bored now? Yeah, I do. It's my own fault because I get lazy and I should be writing, a lot more. But COVID kind of knocked it out of me, believe it or not.
It did that to a lot of people, though. It's really hard when you're dealing with something like that, and it's societal. So this is this big universal thing happening to everybody, and a lot of writers a lot of creatives got derailed during that time.
Well, I kept thinking I was in a state of suspended animation. You guys know what about that period. MB, I'm sure you remember that too. I don't know if you were the same way, but I could not make a decision about what was going to happen tomorrow.
Yep.
Because tomorrow, this whole COVID thing's going to be over. Then I can get back to doing what I should do. And that lingered. I mean, that went on with me for about 2 years. So, it was, I don't even know how to characterize what it was. I'd love to do a panel on that sometime and see what other people, did. Do a panel at the conference.
It was weird because I think a lot of people were feeling it and struggling with it, but nobody was talking about it. So I think that there could be definitely really interesting conversations on that.
Yeah.
Like a writer's conference.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm thinking. I mean, it would be fun. It wouldn't be fun. Yeah, it would be fun to do that and just kind of recap, from your recollection, what was it like for you? And I'll gladly tell what. I mean, it was a state of suspended depression, I think, or animation, or I don't know what, but it was not a fun time. We all know that.
No, it was a crappy time, and more traumatic for some than others in various ways, and people losing people left and right, and but just universally, people not knowing what the next week held for them.
Yeah.
Nobody could know. Nobody in any position could know what next week was going to look like for anything, and what you weren't going to be able to get at the grocery store, and when you were going to get toilet paper again. I don't know. But
and when could you go to the grocery store, and would you be able to get in, and would other people be masking, and were you going to be masking? And
a lot of interesting things came out of that COVID period that, calling or emailing, ordering food from the grocery store, and even having it delivered to your house. Another thing that I have done quite a few times is to have Zoom appointments with one of my doctors.
Yeah, and a lot of them are staying with it because my daughter had to see a pulmonologist, and the lady was like, "Oh, I don't do in person for these types of appointments, so this will be online." Okay. Yeah. Then I had to make a follow-up with the ENT because they wanted to look at her tonsils, and they're like, "Well, did the pulmonologist not look?" And I was like, "No, because we were on the computer, and that would have been strange."
Yeah.
She would have been, "Here, put your mouth up against the camera and let me see if I shine a flashlight in there." So, and I'm like, no, and the lady kept saying, "So she didn't even look and she sent you here." And I was like, yes. Like, what part of this is hard for you to understand? Do you want me to give you her name and number? You call her. I'm tired of this conversation.
I can't believe a pulmonologist would not want to see you in person.
That's because it was about sleep apnea. So one of the things they're going to be checking is like the back. So yeah,
that's crazy.
She was like, "Let's put her on a CPAP." And I'm like, we're gonna do that right now without you having seen her in person. Okay, well, I'm gonna have her tonsils checked first. We're gonna do this. But
and there are several hoops we have discovered at our house. There are several hoops you have to jump through before you can get a CPAP.
Yeah.
It's not like a doctor can go, "You need one." You have to have the test, and then you have to have the other test. And you might have a third test, but maybe your insurance won't let you have the third test. Jesus. Don't get me started on the CPAP.
I've had a CPAP for about 16, 17 years, and I'm glad I got it. A lot of see ads on TV. Well, trying to take this thing off, and it's like, living inside of a jungle or something with branches sticking down. It isn't that bad. And
no, and I will say the pulmonologist was like, I think it's a great way to go, and most people won't take it. And I'm like, well, we don't have a problem pursuing that, but you've mentioned like there might be something else. So if it's her tonsils, let's deal with it now instead of she's a full-grown adult and because that surgery is really bad for you the older you get. So 16 is already pushing it. So I was like, let's look at that and then see perhaps that's fine if we have to do it. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's always good to see you.
Of course. Yes. It's always nice to talk to you. And
you too. I love you both.
Finally, it's a true crime podcast. So this is going to be one of those things that people can appreciate. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. And we'll talk to you next month.
Yes, we'll be back next month.
And we can do more.
That's right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
Find us on Facebook and Instagram or at our website, mysteriesmonstersmayhem.com.
Please like, rate, and review, follow, and share wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.
Thank you for listening and supporting our podcast. We'll be back with more shenanigans.